Howdy, folks. Think this might be episode 12, maybe 13. I still have to count. I keep on doing this every time we start. I also should do the YouTube thing where like you guys should subscribe and click the like button and all those things down below. Comments would be great. I know that there is a larger group of people than normal watching today. So if people have questions for me or Eduardo during the show, please feel free to put them in the comment section. We'll try to get to them as we see them, and I'm looking forward to that. So I think I found Eduardo first because I started poking around about this idea that I had called sociotechnical architecture, and Eduardo and a few other people, including Nick Thune, I think, also had this. We're poking around at the same space. How does architecture and sociotechnical systems kind of fit together? And I've really enjoyed watching his talks online and talking with him on Twitter about some of these ideas. And I'm psyched today because I think we have a lot of common ideas and, obviously some differences. It'll be fun to kind of play with those together. So, Eduardo, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody so we can kind of get an idea who you are?
Sure. So I have a sort of... I did all sorts of things in my career. I know, roughly almost 20 years as professional. So I was academic for around 6-7 years. Was not really my thing. I actually learned that I'm sort of a more pragmatic. I like to see things come live, and also academic life can be challenging at times. So I had my own startup where I tried to explore my academic research. Very fun experience. I failed, but it was fun. And then I sort of entered the career of being more a full-time software engineer, eventually architect, tech lead. And I think probably since you start seeing those articles and presentations online, Jabe, I started looking more at, I know that we need to design these technical systems, but there is a lot of things happening around them. And this sort of opened the door to that, to the work of Nick Thune. At the time I was also playing with that, and many other people were sort of like, we need to look broader than this, and that's roughly what happened. And this turned also my career. I'm now focusing on that sort of that bigger perspective, not just the technical systems. And I like to sort of think that I on my independent consulting activities, I'm trying to help organizations to achieve a more sustainable, fast flow of change. So how can we look into these different things, including platforms and including many other things, so that the organization is able to basically respond to whatever is happening around them. And then, so that's roughly my sort of trajectory.
Cool. So I usually ask people, when I ask people on, we always have these conversations about platforms because it's a platform thinking work podcast, and we get different definitions of platforms. So usually at the beginning here, just set your frame for us so we have a general idea of what we're going to be talking about for this episode. Like what is a platform for you? How should we think about it for this episode?
Yeah. I think you probably, if you have 13 episodes, you probably got 13 different answers.
Absolutely.
Because it's a rather ambiguous term. And what I want to make clear is that when I think platforms, it's not just a technical thing. That's we get a lot of hype nowadays around that. And it's not just this technical thing, that even worse, that you just buy and you use. So I think of platforms as like something that tend to exist within organizations. And sometimes it's the organization itself, but I'm not going to go there, where you can sort of stand on and build other things on top of it. And I often bring on your 3 Economies paper, as this is something that you can sort of build differentiating work, because as an organization, your products, your services are not always going to be differentiating. In time, they just tend to be copied or whatever. So if you bring some of those things that, say, all of your teams, all of your products start having as common, and you can sort of abstract into something where you can build other things on top of. That's sort of my mental model for platforms, and that sort of curating that thing, those capabilities that then allow you to basically build other things on top of.
Yeah. But I had a couple things just in your definition that would be fun to poke around a little bit. And so, like, one of them, in relation to some of the conversation we've also had prior to this, is this idea that like a platform's like a shared place that we collaborate or that we work together on something. It's like in the terminology that I tend to use, it's a commons, like. And there's an interesting version of that I think you pointed to, which is this idea that like there's a form of governance involved in that. There's a form of like shaping it and working together, which is maybe different than working on a product specifically, and that maybe that like idea of governing a shared resource might have something to do with like how that resource evolves differently than maybe a product might evolve. So I don't know. How should we think about kind of like the way in which a platform comes into being, exists, is managed by an organization? Like what are those things like in your mind?
Yeah. So I think indeed we were talking before the podcast a bit on that, and I think there is something interesting there, which is a platform should. I try to think of platforms as something that connects to the value and the problems that the organization is trying to solve. So how can we connect back to that? And this brings several interesting perspectives, which is we often see platforms as something that is there inside where we place complex things. But if we start thinking from the perspective I was mentioning, sort of you start seeing this idea of where is it being originated from.
Yeah.
So if you as a business, your say your product teams, just to make the distinction, right? So you have teams working more on platform products or whatever we would call them, and then you have teams that are more focused on working on your business problems, right? So they are more customer facing, let's say, right? So they what team topologies would call a stream aligned team, right? So they are aligned to that stream of value. They are listening to the customer. They're listening to the market, the competitors, all of these things that are happening in the environment around the company. And what I think is, in my mental model of thinking about platforms, is we should try to use those signals, which tend to reflect into the product teams and sort of the explorations they are doing. They are pioneering, for example, adopting machine learning to solve a complex problem around security. And we as an organization, we didn't do that we never did that, right? So, but you start having many teams pioneering that because that's helping them to actually solve that problem they have, like reducing the number of false accounts being created or fake products on a website or on an online shopping website, whatever. That pioneering work is where I think the genesis for platforms should be coming from. If this is a single team that's doing that and it's very contained, whatever, maybe the team should just do that, and they just they pay for that, all of that work that needs to be done in a sense, right? So if you think, but if you start seeing that emerging as being because, and I also like to bring in the learning idea. So if you have an organization where knowledge is flowing, so teams are sharing knowledge, or there are ways of, you start seeing that some other teams are seeing, oh, this is a great opportunity for us to actually also apply it here.
Yep.
And that sort of starts bringing up this new capability in the organization, which eventually starts forming as being, hey, this could be beneficial to actually abstract this into a separate team, a separate component that would then serve all of these teams, because for them, this is nowadays, it's sort of consolidating. It's something that they are not changing a lot. There are all sorts of signals that can be used for that, and then that sort of creates the sort of the genesis for maybe making this a more scalable thing that more teams can use and can use more easily, and going to team topologies, ideas like this can reduce the cognitive load of these product teams, because that's something that they can just use out of a platform. I maybe I can give you a good example to sort of crystallize this. So I was working at this online shopping company here in the Netherlands called bol.com, and I saw this multiple times. One of them was we wanted to measure how were customers using the website, and then a few people started playing around with, okay, let's use some big data tools. Let's put something together, and one or two teams started playing with that, but they were owning this. So they were they were doing their work, building their features for the web shop, whatever, and then they were also building this capability. But more and more teams started using that, and eventually it became clear that this cannot be something that this product team is owning. They are not able to scale this and do other things. So it became clear that it would be beneficial to actually bring this into a sort of a team that would have like full-time focus on owning this thing. And this ended up being used by maybe 50, 60 teams. This is a big organization that are now using that, and they want to have that reliable thing. But if you look back into the history of that started on the need of a team that wanted to actually measure more. They were using some Adobe out-of-the-shelf tool, and it was not enough. They didn't have enough precision on the measurements that they could do. They needed to build something. But that was sort of the history of this. All that platform actually came to be, and nowadays this is multiple teams. They build tools for easy like clients that can be used in different on the website, on the mobile app, on all sorts of things, and they continued this. This is something that in time evolved and nowadays exists, and they use other technologies, other things, but that sort of shows this the genesis and how this came to be. I like to think in that way. I think and if you look, it starts from a business problem or something that you want to do, and not necessarily just. I like the idea of DevX and making life for developers easier, but normally there should be something else behind, or in general there is something even deeper if we start looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, so like the way that I usually try to describe, I think what you're saying is through this idea of incremental elaboration, right? And the idea of that is to say that like code, it's not just like a life cycle, but it's like an evolutionary cycle where it graduates to different levels of quality, where the quality is defined by what is being used to solve for right now, right? So for instance, I sometimes say to people, if you were to have a brand new idea, like new idea, untested idea, and you went and developed it as a fully idiomatically correct software piece with lots of unit testing and integration testing, deployed on a very sophisticated platform as a platform component, and then you showed it to somebody and nobody ever wanted to use the damn thing. Did you just waste a lot of money? And I think the answer is obviously like, yeah, you just wasted a huge amount of money and time.
Yeah.
So really, like the first step of discovery often is like, don't like, you don't need a lot of unit tests. What you need is just enough to like show somebody something and see if they want to use it and iterate on it quickly. And then if they like it, then you could like graduate up to another level of quality, which is moving from proof of concept to, for instance, production quality, right? Like we're going to put this into a production environment. But that often then would be only for one application. And then you might, as you pointed out, have other people be like, we want to use that. Well, we want to use that is a different problem to solve. It's a problem that a platform can solve, and it's a different set of qualities that the same functional code needs to have, multi-homing or integration with other frameworks or whatever. And so to me, like one of the things I've tried to convince people a couple times is like, when I was a CTO, one of the things I would do is that if you were doing a proof of concept, I had like two languages you were allowed to put in my production environment, right? So I think it was like Python and Java. And so if you wanted to do a proof of concept, you weren't allowed to use production licensed languages. And what I meant by that is like, you can write it in whatever you want, but you can't write it in one of the languages you can put in our production servers. And the reason for that was, you now want to put it on the production server? Great, you should rewrite it in the code and at the quality that would be ready for production. But prior to that, you should just be screwing around and do it in Python, or, whatever, PHP or whatever. And I often wonder, like, if it's not something that we should be better about as architects, which is kind of saying, I mean, yes to what part of what you're saying, which is like it evolves from products onto the platform. But like as architects, how do we advise people not to try to do it themselves, not to try to make some shared component that lives inside the Streamline team? How do they know when it's time to like call up the platform team and be like, I need you to handle this now because this is like starting to get outside of the realm? And like as a slightly sideways version of that, there's also like often this idea of like shadow IT, meaning like people putting servers under desks and stuff like that. Of course, yes, you want to prevent shadow IT, but only at a certain scale, really. If you completely clamp down on shadow IT, like you completely clamp down on that stuff, either you quash people's ability to be innovative inside the organization, or you force them to look for other ways of getting access to those resources, like they're just going to go to AWS and open up an account with their credit card or something like that. So like there's this balancing act of like, how do we like help people understand when that phase transition is, and how do we encourage it without squashing innovation, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot there, Jay. But yeah, I think that, so as long as you are experimenting, I'm also of the philosophy that teams shouldn't be blocked from trying new things. Because to me, this is where you, again, going back to my example, this is where you start actually seeing where there is new opportunities to actually develop a capability that is really useful for us. They should be allowed and motivated to do that. And I think if you do that, you actually also may create let's use the word culture, or like the feeling comfortable on actually speaking up and be able to have conversations on, hey, this is something that actually could become a platform capability. So I think having that base in your organization where you, the way you work, the way you operate as an organization is allowing these things to happen. And also having ways. And I think this is, you mentioned the role of architect. I am a strong believer that organizations benefit from having some architects doing that sort of work, which I call more like an enabling work. Like they can sense, for example, they are not controlling what you need to do with team, but they are more on observing these signals that sometimes is difficult for a team to see on their own, because they tend to sort of work on a smaller scope of work, and there are conversations in organizations. You start seeing, hey, they are also using this way of doing performance testing. Oh, let's talk with each other, let's pair, whatever. But sometimes if you have these more modern architects that are listening to some of those signals, they can play a pivotal role on connecting these capabilities that are forming in multiple places of the organization, many times at the same time, or they are sort of organically coming up, and having a conversation with them, and maybe with people from platform. Maybe the platform doesn't yet even have anyone that knows about that. So maybe those people are the first candidates of actually becoming a platform team. Some of those people, pioneers that are doing that work. That's something that I have experienced firsthand, like having architects, tech leads, these people that tend to work more cross teams, playing this function of helping sensing and amplifying these signals of things that are sort of becoming things that that should be platform capabilities.
Right.
And then the teams, if you have the right incentives, the right elements in place, the teams are extremely happy on collaborating and working with other people to show off the cool things that they are doing. This new, I have another example on this organization. So we were also Java shop. So we were using Spring at the time, Spring framework, not Spring Boot was not yet even there. And gradually, what you start seeing is if you add on top of Spring some components that allow you to, I don't know, to do metrics, to do logging, to do all sorts of things. Well, why don't we package this thing, and everyone is benefiting from that, and everyone contributes to making that better, and you have 60, 70 teams that are making that better. So people were really excited about doing that, and sort of showing off how cool the sort of this thing that is helping other teams can be helpful to all of them. And eventually this became a platform team. So they are nowadays they still exist. They are now probably even more than a team now, because there is a lot of things that kept on being consolidated into that platform as being this, some people call the paved path, right? So the sort of things that most teams use. Eventually we went to cloud, so things, integrations with some cloud aspects were also consolidated there. But so you sort of see if the right incentives are there, they sort of naturally happen. And in my experience, teams don't feel like, hey, they are messing up with our baby, we want to keep it, because they start seeing, hey, actually, if these people are working on that and maintaining it with proper time, proper funding, proper we can just use it, and we actually are able to go faster on building our features, our product. That's the thing that we should be focusing on. Although as engineers, you always like to tinker around with these things, right? And that's also what I observed, is that example of the Spring Boot framework. It still today accepts pull requests to add new modules, or people can contribute to that. And but there are people that are more full-time, making sure this can be used by more than 100 teams now. I think even more than 150 teams. So you, as you said, you need to bring another level of qualities when you want that. You don't want this thing to break and affect so many teams. But so there is a lot there. But
Yeah.
I think this is sort of again a natural evolution that if you create the conditions for this to happen, and I again talk about this idea of allowing learning to happen and allowing people to actually do things and not always be controlled to do every single thing. So you get these things to sort of come up in the organization and driven by the business needs. So like the real problems that you are facing.
Yeah, I mean, so like when I'm listening to you, one of the things I'm thinking about is, so like, to be clear, I think what I'm hearing partially is you saying, like, in the example you gave, the platform kind of emerged from the teams. There wasn't like a platform team, and the platform team was like wandering around the building being like, what should we platform?
No, they don't exist, Jabe. They were not there.
Yeah.
The people that today are on that platform, they were I think some of them are still there actually, like pioneering engineers that really loved to doing that. And they were exceptionally good at building high quality products, high quality codes, really also liked to listen to people, and they were good at collaborating and not being this sort of defensive of like, this is my code, I don't touch it. So lots of these traits, and eventually they even have a sort of a product person there. There is a product manager or product owner. I don't remember anymore which one we used, but it was there. It was not just this. So there is quite some thought going into more the scaling of this.
Yeah, so like, to me, it's like one of the things, I mean, sometimes I try to say to people, like, you kind of have to have the problem that platform is trying to solve before you can try to have the platform. Like, kind of the socio-technical version of this, right, is like, your problem is not that you don't have a platform. That's not actually your problem. No. Like, having a platform probably won't solve your current problems unless they happen to be platform problems, right? Like, you need to make sure that there's a fit there. And part of what I hear you describing is there's this kind of moment in the kind of evolution of not the platform, but the firm, where people start trying to figure out how to collaborate, and assuming that they try to figure out how to collaborate on shared components, it's possible that that thing will become a platform. But part of the conditions that are required in the business for the platform to exist is the ability to collaborate like this. And that's not something that emerges because you have a platform. It's something that emerges because you have the problems that platforms solve for, and you start by trying to solve them directly, and then eventually kind of find a platform from there or something like that. Is that roughly? Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah.
And I think this is why when I talk about platform, I like to think valuable and usable. So they come from this real need, and so I talk about teams pioneering something. So multiple teams start actually doing that. Also the idea of enabling teams. So from team topologies, as these people that are sort of helping other teams to upskill or address some missing capability. So if you start having these problems on multiple teams, maybe you shouldn't build immediately a platform, but maybe you just put together some of the people that you have that know a lot about that, and they go let them try to help these teams on addressing those missing capabilities or missing skills. And then from there, if you go through that exploration, or that, like, these people at the moment are the ones that probably know the most about this. And sometimes you need to bring people from outside because there is no knowledge in the organization, but you see that this is an area that we need to know more or to address some problem. So if you have those spending some time there, then you will have more knowledge or more awareness of what actually we would need to bring into, to consolidate into a platform. So it's like if that happens, I think we are, when we go into the stage of saying, hey, this, we really need a platform around this. By then you have spent time, you have played around with what would you need for your organization, for your specific context, for your teams, instead of just saying, okay, oh, this smells like we have a problem here around containers. Oh, let's buy Kubernetes and let's hope it's going to solve everything. So really, yeah, maybe you jumped a few steps. Maybe you need it, and it was a bet that it went well for you. But this is like a betting on the dark, right? So.
Yeah, and I think it, the betting metaphor, right, with platforms is really poignant, because like a bet in a marketplace tends to have much more asymmetric outcomes. In other words, like it's cheap to do with potentially large so like deploying a feature or a prototype is relatively cheap with potential high upside. Most platform stuff is pretty expensive to deploy, frankly.
It is.
And the upside is relatively limited because it's primarily about kind of like, in my mind at least, creating the right kind of organizational dynamic to enable efficiency and enable kind of, again, differentiation. But it itself isn't going to pay for itself directly in a way that's observable. Like so like you get this kind of like build it and they will come mentality, that kind of big bet stuff. It seems to not play out very well for most platform games.
I think it's really it can go wrong very I think it's not the way to do it. And yeah, so it's like I think there is a difference there on, so if you are a customer facing again, a customer facing team or a set of teams, you are sometimes you need to bet or experiment. And I'm not saying that platforms shouldn't experiment things. That's not like you are not allowed to experiment. But it tends to be more, if you look at it tends to be more like where we consolidate and scale things than just being on the bleeding edge all the time, right? So what you mentioned, right? So we need somehow to justify or to motivate why this should become a platform capability. So there is so the experimentation for me for platforms happens or probably happens better when it's still on the space of the product teams that really justify that, because this helps them to reduce their response time by half of the time. So by adopting some new technology or whatever. And then this eventually evolves and we start learning more, and then this makes a lot of sense. All of these teams are now playing with that. We can consolidate it into a proper product and platform. So this also reminds me a lot of like the worldly mapping phasing, right? So the platforms tend to be a bit more to the right on that graph in my perspective in organizations. So yeah, I think there is something important there, and it's certainly like a good principle to have as you are bringing platforms live in your organization.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing it reminds me a little bit of, so I used to talk a lot about, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I talked a lot about swarming. So like there's been a long-standing idea in the Agile community about like long-standing teams and like this idea that you shouldn't. And I used to try to argue that there should be this idea of swarming, like this temporary teams that kind of got together to solve particular kind of problems that were cross-cutting concerns or across the organization. Or, like the dumb one I always use is like, we want to move from Oracle to, Postgres.
Yeah.
Like, so that's a problem that's affecting multiple product teams. And so let's swarm on that as opposed to trying to ask each team to solve it independently.
Yes.
And
yes.
Heidi Helfand has this book, Dynamic Reteaming.
Yeah. I know
that's
it.
one of the patterns that she talks
Yep.
about. And so one of the things that I think about when I think about platforms sometimes is this idea that I think that swarming probably made a lot of sense when what was being shared was primarily code bases, right? So we swarm to like create this code that we're going to share. But really the thing that I think becomes interesting in platforms is that platforms are operational. They're not just code. They run. They're in production, right? They're in, and so like you can't just swarm and then like everybody goes back to their teams, like who's running the thing now. To me, like some of what happens in platform is that the experimentation activities of a platform are like that swarming activity, right? And then there's someone or something or some team or some funded thing that takes over the thing that was developed during the swarming.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah 100%. I have a good example of that also from this organization. I worked a lot with which is also connects a lot with these dots. So I worked with them a lot on trying to scale their data science discipline. So a lot of products, a lot of things they needed to scale it up, but they had these classic DevOps teams that really owned particular parts of the products, etc. And then when we started, we there were a lot of challenges around data engineering. So and a few scripts work fine, right? So for a while, you just put together some cron jobs, and this runs during the night, and then you have your data. And in the morning, you can run this job, whatever. But then a lot of things started to fail, and people had no clue what was going on. So many of the teams affected by that, they swarmed together with some people from platforms, people from different platform teams that were handling things that were more like data infrastructure, data-related things. And what they realized was they would really benefit after experimenting for a while. We would benefit from using, at the time was Airflow. So this is like an open source project for orchestration of jobs, and it's very handy for a data engineering thing. So what happened there was that it literally, and I was part of that, like helping to create conditions for people to feel okay to swarm, but involving someone already from platform, because this was so big a problem that we knew this one way or the other, we need to get something here because we were losing money in a sense. So a lot of things were failing. We couldn't produce forecasts. We couldn't do some things that were really critical. And that at that time was interesting because you had people pioneering from teams having the problem and trying to fix things on their own, and then people also joining from platform teams that were already looking at that sort of thing. And then eventually they realized they did some workshops with teams that were doing that sort of were having that sort of problem. And from that it came that this seems to be a good way to go forward. So it ended up being adopted, like that part of, okay, now what do we do with this? Because this needs to be operated and properly maintained in production. And so those platform teams ended up absorbing that experiment as something that was very successful and validated with the teams that were having the problem. That was a great example of this collaboration and experiment. And I think that the pattern of swarming made a lot of sense there, because the people that were basically suffering from the problem, they came together and they bring all of this knowledge this is not like hiring someone external to do an analysis.
Yep.
Let's see what we can do here. And no, these were the people with the first-hand problems, and then but the connection there is how the in time the culture of platform already being comfortable on being part of those conversations, which is an aspect that I also find very interesting, and maybe also picking up your brain, which is, as we said, platforms products tend to be more like on the right side of a worldly map. So it also is, if we follow this sort of principles and patterns, it also means that things that don't necessarily need to go there and need to be on platform are not bothering and sort of polluting the time and minds of people that are maintaining and developing these platforms. So that also is a very interesting pattern that I observed, and I think it's very relevant because we talk about cognitive load of streamline teams, etc. But platform teams also have brains and limited resources, so we also need to think about them, and that seems to be a good way to, for the lack of better word, sort of filter what actually comes into their radar, right? So it's not every single idea that a very imaginative engineer has to solve a problem immediately. Hey, platform, let's look into this and let's spend 2 days exploring that. That's not yet there. So I think it's a good dynamic. It's also a good pattern to keep in mind, to also, because people work on platforms are also people with that need to be cared for, in a sense.
And I think it's partly that, like, again, as you're describing it, what is the quality or the type of problem a platform's trying to solve? And the answer is, it's not trying to host individual functions for bunches of different teams. It's trying to serve multiple teams at the same time against the same particular set of functions or services, right? Like, if your service is only being used by you, great, you should maintain that thing. And you want it to be on the platform, great, you should probably go out and try to convince other people that they want to consume it, so that there's a reason for us to put it on the platform. And nobody's stopping you from doing that. But just like being like, I don't want to maintain this part of the operational code base anymore, I'd like you to maintain it. That seems to be right.
No, that's that screams like an anti pattern every time I see it, and even I get a bit nervous when people are giving these sort of patterns for migration of code bases to platforms. Is this something that will benefit multiple teams? So again, the questions you raised, Jabe.
And so, like, I think the other thing, like, to jump back really quickly, the other thing, and this is a theme that I think I've been poking for the whole conversation, but like, part of what I think you're saying, so like, I would use the weird word praxis in this particular case, but like, one of the illustrations I would have of that. So in Agile, one of the things I say to people all the time is, one of the main things Agile did was it changed what was being inspected from inspecting the plan to looking at the thing that was actually built. Like, instead of trying to correct the plan over and over again in order to get a better outcome, just look at the outcome and improve the outcome directly, right? In the case of like this thing that you're talking about with like swarming and all this kind of stuff, part of what's really happening, right, is that it's not that we need to get aligned on what to build on the platform, or so we need a platform strategy from some like third party or McKinsey or whatever. What we need is to get people in a room to work on the problem together. And when they come up with some sort of answer that belongs on a platform, that's what goes on the platform, because they worked on the thing, not on some sort of like getting aligned on a strategy. There's like less of a direct platform strategy, as in like, we're going to build these capabilities, and more of these seem to be capabilities that we need to explore together. We need to work on them together in order to figure out what the platform should actually be.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is not to say that as you sort of, especially as a platform starts existing, there I think you also need to think about sort of how are you evolving this, or how you are getting rid of things. There are things there that you will need to consider, but 100% with you on the sense that, again, looking at what are the things that are popping up, and as an organization, do the work to allow your people to feel comfortable on actually pairing up to look at the problem. Don't penalize that, and this is why I'm a big I really like the idea of enabling teams and this idea to start becoming a part of our vocabulary, because it touches on something that organizations tend to be a bit allergic to, which is these people, these really good experts, are spending time on something and they are not building a product feature. So they are not picking up Jira tickets. However, if you start seeing, if they are looking at problems that, I don't know, talk about 100 teams, if you start making some back of the napkin calculations, man, you start seeing how the return on investment that this can bring. So if you have some of these people that are sort of already exploring the problem and know more about it, and they actually they start coming together and understanding what's going on, such as the example of this orchestration, data engineering orchestration framework, that starts saving a lot of daily, a lot of money that was being lost because the forecasts were not as good. So we were asking more products to be on our warehouses, whatever. So, but for that to happen, you cannot simply ask teams collaborate, right? And then you do your annual review and you start saying, hey, yeah, but you are spending too much time playing around with these things, and this is not your responsibility. Why are you doing that? So if the incentives are not right, and this goes into I always like to point people to the original Conway's paper. Read the whole thing. Don't just read the popular sentence, because it talks there about incentives for managers to allow for this to happen, so that your organization can sort of find, explore the things that will then create the systems that are more maintainable, more the systems that need to be there, right? So the necessary designers, the people that have the knowledge, are doing it, and then you end up with better systems. So it's very important, I think, to work on that. And again, going into the enabling teams idea, I think this is a great sort of language to start codifying this in organizations' operating models. Like, let's allow some of the people that are exploring new challenges that we are seeing that we need to actually experiment with, because we really have a big problem here. We cannot, we are having a lot of mistakes on our prediction, so we need to fix that, and allow, give space and sort of have this culture of it's okay to spend time on that. And so this is something I spend a lot of time leading this. I was leading what I called it a network of tech leads in this organization, and big focus I had with them is, you are not the designer of the team's things. You are about looking at these challenges they are having, and how can you help them to actually, so then they can go and solve the problems. But help on creating those dynamics where people on teams having problems can show up and can go and talk with other people. So I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. And
I think it's like, Yeah, I think like one of those things I used to so I used to try to differentiate architects, and for when I was talking to architects, I try to
Yeah,
differentiate like, listen, there's two different kinds of like primary forms of architectures. There's approval architecture, like you're here
yeah,
to like rubber stamp things, and then there's architecture as design. And largely what I meant at the time by architecture as design is like you're responsible for like shaping literally the space people work in. Like, the code
yeah,
shapes what they think about, how they like, you are responsible in the same way an architect is responsible for like putting a building together, making sure there's common places to gather, making sure there's private places to be, making sure that people can get to the
yep,
electrical grid and the sewage system without, like all of those things are part of being a good architect.
indeed.
That's a different kind of architecture than just saying like, yeah, we approve that you're using this or that
Yeah,
component, or you're using the reference architecture correctly. Because the
yes,
second one's more about probably interacting with people and saying, does
yeah,
the lobby work for you? Like
yeah,
that type of stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%. I really think that. So I've been toying around with this idea that I think when I talk about architecture, I keep on coming back to learning, design, and decision making. Are we allowing this?
Mm,
Are we making this better?
mm.
Because especially in large organizations. So if you are a startup, everyone talks with each other, and
Sure,
we will
absolutely.
figure it out. Everyone does everything. But if you start growing, are you catering for those things to happen across the organization so that that team doing recommendations, they are aware of what the search team is doing, and so the learning flowed, and they are more equipped to produce a design and take a decision
Mm,
that's not destroying what the search team is doing. So
sure.
the knowledge is flowing, and then it allows for better design and decision making. And talking about that, there are more things, as you mentioned, Jabe, creating these sort of what can we bring on to, so that those teams are approaching architecture more equipped. So what are they lacking? How can I help, instead of just saying, okay, do the design, send it to me, and next week I will tell you about it, or even worse, I will do it and I will throw it to you, and
Yeah.
you need to do it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think if we don't do that, as like especially modern organizations where things are changing all the time, it becomes very challenging for to allow to be able to respond to whatever is happening, because things just slow down, and people will leave.
Totally.
Good people will not be sort of, hey, I'm able to do this. Just yeah, don't yeah. Anyways, it's yeah.
So I think like the other thing I think about, I love talking about architecture, and I like wish more people were. I think that a lot of damage was done to architecture over the last 20 years by a lot of people who were architecting relatively small scale things. Like architecting a web application in the 90s is not exactly the same thing as architecting a banking system in the late 2020s, right? Like it's just a different thing. They're not doing the same thing. The architecture that supports a website is not the architecture that supports Google.
Yes. Yeah.
And so like one of the things that I think often when I think about that is like I think a lot of architecture has become or until recently was this idea, like software architecture was the idea of like shaping again the cognitive load or the cognitive space of the developers, and making the componentization the right size to fit in teams, and like all this kind of stuff like that, APIs and all that kind of stuff, which I think is all useful and not wrong.
Yeah.
Definitely part of the socio-epistemology stuff, the like ability for groups of people to know about a thing together and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
All good. But in larger organizations, and for people who've been kind of around for longer, like infrastructure architecture doesn't think almost like that at all, because when you're talking to an infrastructure architect, they're going to be building like a network or a data store or a compute pod or something like that, and they're not going to ask you questions about cognitive load. They're going to ask you questions about how many MIPS do you need, how many bits are you going to write to disk per minute, what's the throughput of your network. And when they answer those questions, they're not vague answers, they're promises. Oh, you need this? I promise that this thing that I've designed can do that thing. And so I think part of what we need to grapple with when we start talking about architecting platforms, I think we're doing a reasonably good job talking about kind of like, again, cognitive load, API. This side of the house seems to be reasonably covered right now, and I think it needs more exploration, but it's getting there.
Yeah.
But like the promise part, the part where if the platform promises to do something and then it does not do that, then the development teams won't want to use the platform anymore. They'll be like, that thing doesn't work.
Yeah.
So like promise keeping architecture is just like it's a different thing, and it requires a different set of skills. So like when you think about architecture, like what should people be kind of thinking about doing with architecture? Like, how do they know where are the weaknesses you see right now, I guess?
Yeah, I think you touched in a few, and I think it's about this. I think I can use the same framing I just told you about, which is if we have, say, practices and ways of learning to drive what we are designing and we are deciding, if that's sort of if that's present in the organization, you will have less of that challenge that you raised, Jabe. So, for example, as you were talking, I was thinking if you are building some infrastructure for your product teams, having, like, for example, good SRE related practices where you are looking at those SLEs, SLOs, and that's driving where you are investing and sort of being able to learn from that, but also learning what do they need, right? So you are not this this island that sometimes you hear something and you do. It's a two-way street. So having those ways of learning, and I think I really like the SRE related ideas to start observing that. Like it becomes evident. It's something that engineers, product people, everyone can sort of follow and understand. This, we really need to invest in scaling this because it's getting close to the limits that we can accept.
Yeah.
So it becomes a very clear language, and so it's very helpful. And then it goes into the way of you had Andrew a few weeks ago on also on the podcast. Like, are we allowing basically everyone to be part of discussions that are related with architecture? Because if we do that, we certainly can raise more opportunities of, again, having more knowledge to keep up with our promises. We actually make promises that we can keep up with. So that's, to me, these are they boil down for product teams, architecture, but for platforms it's equally important. But the scale of, like you mentioned earlier, the scale of the blast radius of problems on platform can be it's a different scale, right? So
that's right. Yeah.
But again, this begs to actually go into platforms where people are more allowed or more incentivized to have these conversations with the product teams and understand technologies that are brewing outside and stop maybe building things in-house and using more scalable things, like listening to the environment, being the internal but also the external things that can help you improve. I think as I have I've been trying to frame something that I'm calling architecture organization topologies, and sort of, again, there is like an evolution. I have like an axis of evolution on this thinking, and on the left side you have like very controlling and the architect doing things, and on the right you have ideas. You tend to have organizations that go closer to what Andrew was talking about, like advice process, and people can raise issues, and there is a whole spectrum in between, and this is not you cannot change from the left to the right overnight. There is work that you need to do, and and give space to people, and to me that there is a journey to go through. So
it's like I mean it related to that, I have this thing that I keep on banging on about, which is like, don't confuse the role of architecture with the capability of architecture. The role of architecture can be owned by an individual. The capability of architecture is something a firm does, and one of the kind of implications that comes from that is, if architecture is something that a firm does, you have an architecture, even if you don't have an architect. And even if you have a terrible architecture because you've never thought about it, you still have an architecture.
You always have an architecture, as Grady Bush said at a given moment, even if you don't know about it, but you do have it.
So like, so in that way, like, again, I love your kind of focus on like flow of learning, flow of knowledge. Like, architecture becomes a little bit about designing a network of learning and information flow around architectural concerns, around why we care about architecture, around the benefits that and so like, one of the things I bang on about occasionally is just this idea that architects need to talk to product owners and project owners more, because they're both trying to manage the same type of thing, kind of long-term investments that the firm is making into particular marketplaces or to particular capabilities. And if they're not talking to each other, it's just as bad as where we started DevOps, where the developers weren't talking to the operators.
It's the same thing. 100%. I wrote an article like 2 years ago, I think. I called it. So DevOps, in many organizations we are getting there. But we need this sort of prod tech, like product and technology. We need to talk with each other because we are basically doing the same. We are the same organization trying to get the same thing. So why aren't we able to sort of work together, or have teams where these people are on the same team and be able to involve engineers on product discovery activities? Why is that a problem? If that's most likely an advantage for you as an organization, and the same for architects and business and product. So I definitely think this is that's why I'm referring a lot to the idea of learning, because if you can experiment together and you bring all of these perspectives together, you will just learn more things, because it's just natural, right? So you are not thinking on the ivory tower alone and looking at the moon, but you are talking with your colleagues about this particular problem that you had no clue that actually that was the problem. So it just becomes very you amplify learning, and with more learning you had Barry here also. I just listened to the episode with Barry. Like you just amplify the ability to decide something on your next step, right? Maybe you don't know what's going to happen after, but you bring all of these elements to help you decide something more valuable and useful for you.
So I think, like, I have a theory, right, about this, which is that one of the reasons why architects get like ivory towered, right? So like my argument is actually that architects get put in the ivory tower. They're more like what's the girl with the long hair in the tower? Anyway, they're put in the tower, and the reason they're put in the tower is because they do that controlling behavior that you talk about. Nobody wants them to show up, because when they show up, they tell people what to do. And so if you're a product owner or a product manager, like you don't want the architect around. You don't want the architect like telling you that you have to do X, Y, and Z that's like not in alignment with where you want to go right now. Because you don't really particularly care about some of the concerns that an architect might be voicing, right? Like, so part of the activity here, right, of getting firms to do better architecture is moving on your axis, is moving towards a place where architects understand that they have to influence and they have to convince and they have to help people understand architecture as opposed to tell people to do architecture. Because there are equally powerful forces in the organization that will just exclude them from the conversation entirely. And then you just set up a fight, right? You just set up this peer level fight where you get product management and architecture just, you know, dueling at high noon, trying to see who can shoot fastest and shoot more, right? So it doesn't anyway.
Yeah, 100%. I think this is, and it's not if just to be. It's the architects on their own, but you can also see a product on their own. You sort of see these different silos just on their own thing, and then pushing for their own perspective. And this tends to be a rather problematic situation because you are not, again, leveraging the insights and building something better, right? So like a true systems thinker, right? So you have these parts and they don't exist in isolation. You cannot get the perfect architecture, the perfect features, the perfect team. It's something that's, and this is what I think where the SocioTechnical architecture things start coming together. Like it's a joint optimization, looking at all of these perspectives and how can we make the best decisions to allow, and this is why I really like to use the idea of sustain, like how can we do things so that we are doing this in a sustainable fashion, because most of the times this is not just a one-off and we throw the CD-ROM and now we are done. Most of the products we are building, we are continuously changing them, and so the same for platforms, the same. It's the dynamics are different. We need to keep that in mind, and so the silos are not conducive to leverage all of these this knowledge, these perspectives. And you really see magic happens. But to be fair, I think this is not going to happen automatically in organizations. There must be some very conscious support by executives, giving space to people, and also working to get this sort of this multidisciplinary efforts to happen. It's extremely important to see that, because you cannot jump it if you don't see it. Architects will continue pushing on high quality, product people on delivering more features, engineering managers on having people that are not burned out and deliver projects. So if they are all on their islands, you get something out at the end, but it will be far from ideal.
I mean, so like I think it's the lesson. You know, I always kind of like think of Conway and SocioTechnical sometimes in the same like frame in my head, but I think like one of the lessons we get from Trist and Longwall, right, is you as an architect, as a person who is responsible potentially for the technical side of the house, you could produce a technically correct architecture. You could go and math it and say, no, this is technically exactly what we need. But when you put it in the social system, the current organizational structure, the current level of learning, the current level of skill, the current liquidity of skill, the current liquidity of availability, all of those things may not be in any way capable of producing or using this technically correct architecture.
Exactly.
And so the interesting thing is that there's two sides of it. One is to say that may mean you'll have to jointly optimize. You may have to make some compromises in the technical correctness of the architecture.
Yeah.
But additional to that, in this kind of ideal present way, building a increment towards what you ideally would want that still fits in the social system will produce more information about what correct would be in the first place.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
yes.
you may find very quickly that your technically correct architecture was not what you wanted at all. And instead of like trying to reorganize and restructure and retrain and rethink a bunch of stuff to get it to work with your completely pristine theoretical technical architecture, it is more of a transition. It's more of an iterative process of, like you're saying, discovery and learning about the practices of architecture, the architecture in use, the architecture in production, the implications for the cognitive load, the implications for the operational system. All of these things are like swirling, and you can't really just go from, and sometimes I say, like, if you want the fastest car, technically it's an F1. But if I give you an F1 car right now, I guarantee you won't be able to use it. Right? It's technically the most fast car on the planet, but it's not the most fast car for you because you cannot drive it.
Big time. I think this is, I think the organizations that realize that and sort of start seeing that, they make the space for that to evolve into this way of being more incremental. And this doesn't mean just doing a sprint and the development team does the sprint there and they are doing their thing and then they release something at the end. It's much broader. It's about bringing these different perspectives on the table, and then, okay, what do we know now? What's like you said, what's the thing that we could actually start doing to start moving towards something better. So using your ideal present canvas idea. So you have an ideal future of something. Okay, it seems to be there. But what can we do now, right? So what's that ideal present that we and if you just take one perspective, as you said, Jabe, it's not going to be ideal. I would bet that, unless you are very lucky, but I don't think we should be governed by luck. So if we have these different perspectives, we need to create ways of allowing them to come to the table and have a good conversation about this, and not having like the hierarchical forces at play that only the architect speaks and the teams are just waiting. Because the teams, most of the times, they are the ones that have the most knowledge about the specific parts of the systems we are building, and if we don't leverage that, it's a waste. It's a waste. There are many bad things that happen from that, and this is why connecting our whole story. It's why I'm really a big believer of allowing the people that are experience the problems, pioneering ways of experimenting and trying to see how to go about it. They need to be they need to have conditions to participate of the design and even decision making. It's not like a nice design and then let's go to the architecture board and see what they think, or let them decide, because that's also a dynamic that tends to lead to to frustrating outcomes, let's say.
So there's this other idea. The last idea is that I wanted to poke around really quickly, but so one of the things I get frustrated about sometimes is people look at, like, they look at like Google, they look at I don't know, Amazon, the Facebook, Amazon, Google, blah blah blah, and they try to argue about who does it the best or who's doing the right way or something like that. And one of the things that I always want to say to people is, like, it should be more interesting that there are multiple ways to respond to the same type of market pressures.
Yeah.
There's not only one way. There's actually like you can realize multiple successful outcome shapes, architectures,
Yes.
to respond to the market. And so maybe it's more interesting to say you shouldn't pick at the beginning. You should be paying attention to the forces they're responding to, the questions that they're asking themselves,
Yes.
and answer those for yourselves. And that's how you'll get to a platform that works for you, as opposed to trying to imitate something without really understanding it. And I think the only way you can get there to having your own realization is, again, to, in the language that you've been using, to have kind of an evolutionary responsive system that learns to respond to what we are asking it to pay attention to. And so in that way, an architect ends up being someone who's like, these are the questions we're asking. These are the forces we're trying to respond to, as opposed to this is how to implement.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's a completely different approach in a lot of ways. It
Completely.
leaves a lot of different space for people too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so when people say, oh, we don't need architects, right? So we don't need maybe you don't need it, because you are already, all of these dynamics we are talking about, they are so ingrained in your organization that people can just sort of more collectively find ways of navigating, and all of this knowledge is being taken into consideration, whatever. But I think in most organizations today, the role of architects that moving towards more this, I like to call it architect as an enabling team, like as an enabler of these dynamics we are talking about. It's very, very important, and should allow to mature on this way of architecting. So I think that's that's something I've been toying around with a lot over the last already few years, and I think it's crucial to allow for that transformation. But again, you need to help. You need to find ways of helping, and because, like you said, and we saw this a lot with people copying the Spotify model, right? Oh, it works for Spotify. Let's do it here. It doesn't work because your organization is so different. There are so many different things at play. Your organization is unique. So if you don't have those feedback loops of learning and bringing different perspectives, you tend to just create some suboptimal structure or suboptimal way of architecting something. So yeah.
I used to tell people all the time when they did the Spotify model, I was like, one of the things that I think is probably impacting the way that the Spotify model is that they have a couple $1 billion in venture capital. Do you have a couple $1 billion in venture capital?
Yeah.
I think that might have something to do with it. I bet if you gave me $2 billion, I could make a lot of healthy developers. Like, they'd be happy, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the standard line nowadays, which I knew lots of people inside Spotify when the model first started rolling out, and everybody inside Spotify knew that it wasn't a real thing. It was marketing.
Yeah. But I think they had, and so they had some of these traits we were talking about, that which so. What we saw was probably some sort of, indeed, like marketing oriented, but like a snapshot of something that they learned it worked for them, and nowadays they have completely different ways of doing it, because they also observed that they needed to make these changes on the way they approach their problems. So yeah.
I mean, the model in a lot of ways, the way I always used to think about the model, talking to people inside, it was more like a starting point. Like you should do Kanban or Scrum. You should do these types of teams, not those types of teams, right? But that's a set of constraints to get the evolutionary things that you've been pointing at to start.
Yeah.
It's not the end state, right? It's not describing the end state. It's describing that you have to make some decisions. You can't make no decisions.
No, that's very important. That's why I don't dislike having as an organization curating. So as you curate platforms, you are also curating maybe some architectural principles that you follow, or you learn. These are really important for us.
Yeah.
I don't know. Every request we get needs to be below these milliseconds. We always expose things via APIs that are documented. All sorts of things that we learn to sort of to scale on sustainably. But again, they come from these learnings. It shouldn't be something that you just say, "Oh, Google does it, right? That's so we will do it," and because they are really good. And no, it will not work, and people will not buy in. So people need to feel that. I think also. Going to the SocioTechnical works, like people need to feel part of the thing, right? So it's if it's imposed on you, you will not get the same sort of you will not feel this is yours or that you are part of it, that you drive it, all of those important aspects.
Yeah, I mean, one last reflection on that. So I used to I hung out with this. He was a Toyota sensei who had ended up at Boeing. So Boeing doesn't do lean, right? They do theory constraints, and so he was doing theory constraints as a Toyota sensei, which I think always think is interesting for lots of different reasons. But he was talking to me, and he was like, "I want to tell you the main difference between working at Toyota and working in an American company. At Toyota, there's the Toyota way. And so when you get a new manager at Toyota, they show up and like pretty much nothing changes. Like there's a new person that you talk to, but that person's responsible for doing the Toyota way. That's what they do. In the United States, there's this weird version of that, which is they think that every new leader is supposed to change something. Yeah. That's how they prove that they're valuable. So every 2 to 3 years, you get some other rando who shows up and just randomly changes random stuff about the system.
Yeah.
And there's no way. And so like this idea of principles, I think is super important for organizations. I don't like, for instance, the Bezos memo and stuff like that. I don't necessarily agree with all the stuff that's in the Bezos memo, but it's hard to argue with the results in some ways. And that's clear. Like these are a set of principles that we have discovered through working together. And this is the way we want things to be done. It's a set of constraints at a very high level, often asymptotic. They can't actually be achieved, but we can get closer to them. Those types of things, I think, are really important for architects to start thinking about. And, when I do architecture with people, one of the things I do is I have a workshop around writing a manifesto. And we go and we look at all these other kind of lists of principles like Unix. What are the principles for developing Unix? What are the principles for developing Bezos and stuff like that? And I say, like, listen, you should not publish a manifesto first. You should come up with a set of which principles of these do you think are interesting and maybe implement one every 6 months and figure out which ones work and which principles go first. And as you implement them, which ones become more important? What'd you learn from them and stuff like that? So I don't know.
Yeah, 100%. So one of the last things I did before I turned the independent consultant on this organization was to we wrote sort of what's it was more on the technical. So what was the tech vision of the organization? And it was really cool because what we did, we created a live document that anyone could question. And we had sessions where we would ask people to facilitate that bootstrapping. And the idea was this is not something that is going to be written on stone. It's something that will change because you raised challenges that and raised sort of observations you have that should change that. And I found that people really resonated with that. Like it's because you are part of it. You can raise. This was even like a GitHub repository. You could raise an issue and say, "This I don't agree with this," and we would have a discussion around that and why. So it becomes a conversation, pretty much like the work from Andrew on the advice process, where everyone can be involved around that, right? So we and raise issues. There are other things there, but like that collective curation of what works for us, what doesn't work anymore, it becomes, again, if you start doing these sort of things, you start creating a culture where people feel that I can speak up and I'm going to be heard, and this is going to be taken in consideration. And it's I think it allows the dynamics we were talking earlier, that people will speak up more easily, that people feel heard, that people take initiative. So it's I think it's very powerful to do that as you said, as an exercise, a collective exercise where people are involved and not seeing this as the final result and then we are done. And if it's not okay, we are going to be fired. No, it's about that. Again, going back, it's about sort of learning what works and not, and improving that. And
I think so. Like, one of the things I'd point out from what you just said that I think is so important is one of the things that I think I learned when I was a CTO. Is like you get organizations to say things like it's not written in stone, or I have an open door policy, or all these ideas where it's like it's open for. And I think the critical thing that you said at the beginning was you can't just say that. Actually, you actually have to create, at least initially, some sort of ritual space or some sort of workshop or exercise where you actively say to people, not you can comment on this, but I am asking you explicitly to comment on this. It's part of my expectations. It's not like I'm trying to make you feel good. I know that's got to be something you have to say about this, and it's my expectations that as a contributor, as someone who works in this organization, that you will contribute to this conversation. It's beyond permission in a lot of ways for me. Sometimes it's literally about being explicit that, no, this is part of the work. This is part of the work. Part of the work is collaborating. It's not optional. I'm not saying it just to make you feel good or to make you feel like you have more freedom or more control. I'm telling you have to do this.
Initially, I think that's very important, and there are, like, you can use different ways of doing this, but it's about sort of it's good to have sort of creative ways of getting people excited about this without having to say, hey, you need to be there. Blah. Organize a few lunch sessions, invite people, bring food, whatever. Organize, do it multiple times. There are all sorts of things that just get people on that. And what I learned is get the engineers to talk about this. Get the people that are sort of on teams doing this to talk about why they proposed something. Why is this a problem for them? Because then that's sort of what we are talking about. Like, you are actually creating the space for the people that are very close to the problems to be part of that, shaping that, and they are saying it. It's not me or the CTO saying, hey, John said the other day that he really appreciated raising this. It's John talking, and so it's there is a lot of dimensions here, but I think it's a very powerful enabling thing in organizations where people feel really excited about doing that and feel heard, and all of these traits that we know that just make people happier and doing better on feeling more inspired. All sorts of things come out of that.
Yeah, and I think like again, I think that like modeling that conversation is so interesting and important. So like again, instead there's this idea of brokerage, which basically is this idea that says like you shouldn't steal credit from people. You should share the credit, and basically that's like if you're the CTO, you shouldn't do the thing where you were like, oh, Bill told me this, and I think everybody else should think this. What you should do instead is like create a situation where Bill can be heard. Right. That makes people want to share with you because then they get to share with more people instead of just you. You don't cut them out of the conversation. You don't kind of like represent them or something like that. I used to do these things where like if someone brought an interesting question to me, we would do an interview where I would be like, I'd ask them questions, but I would model the type of conversation that I wanted other people to be having about these things with the other person. But the other person was going to be the person who was primary, the one talking. It's their ideas. I'm just there to add credibility or to add my, CTO stamp to it so that people will listen. But anyway.
Yeah, 100%. It's sounds like how can I say? People like to be appreciated, and this is extremely powerful. I sometimes it's difficult to explain this in organizations where things are a bit. You have these cultures where people are like heroics culture, right? So there are a few heroes that come and kill all the fires. It's difficult for them to see this, but if you have seen this firsthand, it's amazing. It's incredible how much you amplify the ability for you to actually get all of these outcomes that we were talking about, including great platforms. So
cool. So I've kept you for a long time. Thank you for being generous to your time.
My pleasure.
What are 3 things people might take away from the conversation in your mind? Like, what are the 3 things you'd want them to remember from what we've been talking about?
Yeah. So I keep on going back to sort of trying to, especially if we think a bit about platform thinking, is like the ideas I try to sort of bring up, which is try to see the why. What's the why for a platform? Why should this platform exist? Which tends to be, like I said, in some way there is a sort of a story behind that, which should be something that allows to the business, the organization, and the teams to do better. I keep on. I think this is very important when you have the sort of looking at platform thinking, and then around that sort of allowing these, like the conversation we were just having, like allow the pioneers, the people that are exploring these things to shape those initial things that maybe this is something still on their teams, but like it's the genesis of what eventually may become a platform. Allow them to be part of, to do that and be part of then the sort of the path to be a platform. And I think the last one, we didn't go too much on that, Jay, but maybe we can have one next time in the future, which is platforms evolve, right? So that's it's we sort of touched it like with the SRE ideas and all of that, but it will change. So you as someone building a platform or being part of a platform, listen for the signals from the people that are pushing the boundaries, but from the people that are trying to sort of just use it and are having problems. Things will need to change. It's not. I don't think I have seen a platform that you deploy and then you are done for forever. So things will change. So I think these ideas, which connect a lot on learning, involving people and sort of thinking evolving platforms is sort of the things that, contrary to the more like the hype around the platform engineering, I think we need to go back to that. And I think you are doing a great job here on bringing up these fundamental discussions behind. It's good job for that, Jabe.
Thank you. So if people want to support your work and find out more about what you do, should they go somewhere? Should they read something? Should they? How can they find you in the world?
Yeah, so I wrote my website on my, so it's just there. So it's silva.net. So there you can find sort of writings I've been doing, talks around many of these topics, how to evolve architecture, how to go and sort of, I think there is a big opportunity on organizations exploiting the idea of enabling teams. And I think this is something I'm focusing a lot. I just released a video course with Team Topologies Academy on that, sort of getting some basics for people to start getting excited about that. And so just check my website. I also have my consulting sort of kinds of things that I'm doing there, and you can find it all there. But basically what we talked about today is the sort of thing I've been helping people on, and writing and having a few talks on conferences also. So cool. And I love it. It's something I really like doing. So
excellent. Well, it was awesome to have you, and we should come back and we'll talk more about platform evolution next time. It was super fun to talk with you today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jabe. It was great being here.
Talk soon, man. Bye.
Ciao.